Shalom and welcome to Life Lessons. We are in the segment 32. 32 in Hebrew is a very important one. It is the idea of lev, heart. In Hebrew, heart is lamed bet, and 32 means the heart of things. So here we're coming to this section, and this section in Leviticus, the name of the Parsha is Behar, and as we're going to see, he talks about the heart of things. So first of all, first thing is, the beginning of the section speaks about something very important known as the Shemitah and the Yovel. Shemitah is the sabbatical and Yovel is Jubilee. This is not just about the 7th day that is called the Sabbath. What we're talking about with the 7th year is called the Sabbath and it's called the sabbatical year. What is it? It is as the Torah describes in this section here in the Parshat Behar, chapter 25, that after they conquered the land of Israel and it's been divided to the tribes, and as it was in those days, the income and the sustenance for everyone was agriculture. So land belonged to every one of the tribe. They worked the land, they produced, that's how they lived, and that's how they were able to maintain themselves. What went on right in the beginning is that for 6 days you work, on the 7th day you rest. God rested on the 7th day, so it was known Shabbat, the 7th day of rest. But what came here, a new thing that God has instructed when they come into Israel is that for 6 years you should work the land. On the 7th years, you need the land to be still. You can't work the land. And then on the 8th year, so that means the year after the sabbatical, you start to count again 7 years. So in a system of 49 years, so you had 7 times 7, and every 7th year they rested, and then you had the 49th year. The following year was something special that was known the Jubilee. At the Jubilee, not only that the land rested, but a lot of things went back to its owner. You bought something, so to begin with, you knew that that possibility exists, that it goes back to the owner. You bought a building, an apartment building, something like this. When came Jubilee, it goes back to its owner. It's an interesting system that existed in the time of the temple. Don't want to go into all the details, but a lot of times when people are forced to sell things because they find that it's the only way that they could survive and have some income, and they always wish that I should be able to get back. This was my inheritance. This was the house where my parents lived, my grandparents lived, and things like this. So the Torah allowed such a situation, not only allowed that when a property is being sold, it's known to begin with that this is still the Jubilee. And by Jubilee, it goes back. So it allows the person to make some money and then gets back its property. So that's the idea of Jubilee. But in the sabbatical itself, what happens that the land rested? So it was considered as a no man's land. What does that mean? In Hebrew we call it hefker, that all the poor people are able to come and take. So for 6 years a person works hard, collects everything that he has. From that itself, this tithing that he's supposed to be doing. But then on the 7th year, you don't do nothing. It does not belong to you. The land is not yours. The verse says it belongs to God. And God had said that during that 7th year, all the poor people, the orphans, and all those that need, come and take. And that's how it worked. Now, interesting about this, because the Torah itself addresses this situation. So now, what happens? We know it's not just that it's going to be a problem for the 7th year. It's going to be a problem for the 8th year, because by the end of the 6th year, you are already not allowed to do anything with the land because it's going to grow on the 7th year. So that means by the end of the 6th year, you need it already to rest. So if you look on it from an economics point of view, here we have a situation on the 7th year, he has nothing. So he has to rely, as we're soon going to see, he has to rely on whatever left from the 6th year. Now, on the 7th year, you're not allowed to plant. So that means the beginning of the 8th year, you got nothing either. So it's going to be, so in other words, it's not just when I say don't do anything for a year, it's a loss of 1 year. It's a loss of 3 years here. It's a loss of the end of the 6th, a full 7th, and the beginning of the 8th. Comes the verse, because a lot of times in the Torah we see, they tell us to do things. God says, here's a commandment, just accept it. That's the way it is. You've got a problem, so talk to God. Maybe He could solve your problem. But that's, you want to be connected with what I want? This is what I want. Yes, I believe you should own land. This is not against free enterprise. You're allowed to own land, and you should own land. However, there's one stipulation here, that on the 7th year, it does not belong to you. The land needs to be rested. So many times, the Torah doesn't give us reasons or tries to explain. But here, the verse says as follows. And if you're going to say what we're going to eat in the 7th year, if we will not sow, and will not even gather our produce, so what are we going to eat? So the Torah addresses this question. It's a question that we're going to ask. So what does the Torah say? You should know, God says, that I will direct my blessing to you in the 6th year, and it will yield produce sufficient for 3 years. God promises, a clear promise from God. If you obey me and if you listen to me, you will see that in the 6th year, it will produce so much, enough for that year, enough for the 7th year, and enough for the 8th year. Now, a lot of things has been recorded in Jewish history, and we haven't seen any complaint whatsoever that on those years, during the first temple and the second temple, when they kept the sabbatical year, that anyone should come and complain, it didn't work. And that's an amazing thing by itself. There's certain things we find, certain commandments that the Torah has mentioned, or certain ideas, I would say, that you'd find in the Talmud a discussion. But we know that this never happened. Not about the sabbatical. There's no such a thing. There's not even a complaint of somebody. We're not talking about that nobody complained. If there was a situation, we know about us, Jewish people, that we don't keep quiet. If things don't work out, we do complain. So there would have been written down somewhere a complaint. No complaints whatsoever. So that means people believed, kept it, and it worked. So let's try to understand what's going on over here. Some try to say that this was specially made for the rest of the land. That you can't have a piece of land overwork. It needs to rest. The same as people argue that about human beings, that if a person works non-stop, it doesn't work that way. You need to have a breathing time where, that's why it's very interesting, the Torah's commandment, you should rest on the 7th day, where I believe many nations have copied it, maybe not exactly on Saturday the way we do it, but many others have taken this thing about idea of rest because it helps to invigorate the person to work. Some argue that agriculturally speaking, in the land is the same thing too. They can't have it work all the way. But what's interesting about this, so if we go with this theory, so that means the strongest time for the land is the first year. The second year, it gets weaker. The third year, weaker. Fourth, weaker. Fifth, weaker. Sixth, weak. Very weak. Comes God and says here, I will make a miracle that on the sixth year, it will produce 3 times the amount for the sixth, for the seventh, for the eighth. So we see over here, it can't just be for the land to rest. Because here you have the sixth year, that you would think that this will be the weakest, and on that sixth year, the blessing has multiplied threefold. So no question, it's a clear connection between God's providing, where you see God in action. You follow what God wants, and it happens. But let's try to understand what happens here. What are we supposed to do on the 7th year? Let's say a person that loves so much work. There's some of us that enjoy what they're doing, and especially in those times, farmers, you don't have to go too far away. Even in our country here, there's farmers that they really enjoy, they love what they're doing. And they love when it comes springtime to start planting and sowing, and then the joy of collecting everything before the winter, when fall comes and all these things. And here God comes and says, a whole year, leave things alone. So here's interesting that we have to go back to the beginning of the section known as Behar, that we soon touch on it. God says as follows, Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel and tell them, Ki tava'u ha'aretz, when you come to the land that I will give you, v'shavta ha'aretz Shabbat l'Hashem. The land should rest a Shabbat to God. Doesn't say just the land should rest. The land should rest a Shabbat to God. And then he continues saying, you may sow your field for 6 years, and you may for 6 years prune your vineyard and gather its produce, but in the 7th year, the land should have a complete rest, Shabbat. The way it worked, first there was 6 years, and then the 7th years. But interesting enough, when you read here in the Torah, first he says, come to the land needs to rest. And then it says about 6 years and the 7th. Why in that order? Shouldn't you first say, work your land 6th, and then 7th? Why you mention the 7th before you mention that for 6 years you should work? So the idea is that God is telling us what the whole purpose of working. The whole purpose of working is that we should know that by the 7th year, we give ourselves to God. What does it mean in simple meaning, as we would say in simple English? When we work, even though we believe in God and we trust God, but we don't have so much time to devote ourselves to what God wants from us. We're busy. That's the whole idea in a regular week, 6 days a week, we're very busy. Comes Sabbath, the Shabbat, that's when we give our time to God. We come to synagogue, it's time to spend with the family. That's in a deeper sense what happens here on the 7th year. On the 7th year of Shemitah, God wants we should spend our time studying, learning, strengthening our connection to God. That's what the idea of the 7th. So here's something very interesting. You have the Shabbat that is on a weekly base, but it's not the same. It's not the same as coming and saying that on the 7th year, the land should rest completely. And then we have even more than that is the idea of Jubilee. We, by the way, in Philadelphia, in the Liberty Bell, has this verse from Parshat Behar, and you should call freedom to the land. And that's connected with the idea of Jubilee. On the Jubilee was the idea to call freedom. That's even more higher than just the rest of the Shemitah, of the sabbatical. But we are concentrating of the idea of the of the sabbatical. So that's what it is. You count, and here comes a few interesting ideas in different than what they have the idea of Shabbat. What happens now in the 7th years? Number one, the person is resting. Number two, the land is resting, the earth. Number three, even the produce of the land, that's also resting. What does it mean? Let's say there's a lot of things that grow naturally. You didn't do anything. You didn't plant, but there's certain things, let's say it rained, that on its own, fruit trees, you don't plant every year fruit trees. While it's there, that's it. Every year it would come by itself. Says the Torah, you're not allowed to touch that fruit. It doesn't belong to you. The 7th year, the field and whatever is going to happen to it during the 7th year is not yours, is to give away for people to come take it. So we have three things here. We have the person himself can't work the land itself rests, plus anything that grows in the land that also rests. Now it's brought out that this is a very important statement in the relationship with the person with God, and basically bringing out who is the owner, who's the ultimate owner of this piece of land, of the human being, or of everything that grows in it. And it's in three stages. First of all, the human being has to know that I am at the mercy of God. And therefore, there comes a time everything has to stop, and I have to re-strengthen myself to my commitment to God. Because it's not enough to say, I believe and I do things. There has to be time where a person reflects, puts time and effort to strengthen their relationship. So step number one is about the human being itself. Step number two is the land. Because what is the land? The land is, especially in those days, and that represents for our days too, what a person owns, the belonging, the physical belonging. We live in a world, as we would say, with a hustle, bustle, and we're running around. Sometimes we forget about who's the source of all the blessings. Who's the one that's helping us? Who's the one behind everything that helps each one of us to survive and do the right things? Sometimes we need a quick reminder. So the reminder is not just to the individual that the individual shouldn't do any work. So let's say the individual say, I'm not going to do any work. I'm Jewish. I'm not going to do any work. Maybe I'll hire somebody to come do the work or something else. No. The land itself, the symbol of sustenance, the symbol of income is telling you, let it go. Allow God's blessing. Allow God to demonstrate what He does for us. Then you're going to come and say, wait a second, okay, we're not going to work the land, but then there's the things that naturally grow on it. How about that? No. Total reliance on God that a person should realize step by step. So here where this becomes important. Now, how was this introduced to us? This whole section. By the way, it's important to note, this existed when the temple was built and when they came to Israel. So that was a biblical obligation. In our days, that there's no temple. In Israel, they still follow it, but it's more rabbinic. It's from the rabbi's point of view, not from the biblical. From the biblical point of view, has to be when there is a temple there. So God willing, when Mashiach comes and we build a temple, it will be more in effect. But still, a lot of these issues exist today in Israel. But the introduction to this is beginning of chapter 25, verse 1. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe Behar Sinai lemor. God spoke to Moshe at Mount Sinai, saying, at Mount Sinai. Now, we have a lot of commandments in the Torah. And since Mount Sinai, when the Torah was given, many things are mentioned in the Torah. And many sections begin just with a simple statement. And God spoke to Moshe. God spoke to Moses. Why over here adds on Behar Sinai, in the Mount of Sinai, to tell us exactly where it was? We know that all the rest was on Mount Sinai. So why single out this section with these words, the Mount of Sinai? So our sages teach us something very important, and they tell us, in generally speaking, that from here we learn, the same as here when it comes to this commandment of the sabbatical of Jubilee, God goes into all the details. A lot of commandments in the Torah has just a general statement, and the details are not written. The details were given orally. Here in the story of the sabbatical, a lot of the details are written here. So we say, the same as over here, everything was given on Mount Sinai, so we should know everything else in the Torah is also that way. So that's a very important learning to teach us that anywhere else, it's a comparison. The same as here, all the details were given on Mount Sinai, the same thing, the rest. But the question is back to here, why this one was singled out? There's so many other commandments. Why Passover, the holiday of Shavuot, the keeping of Shabbat? Why was sabbatical singled out the Mount of Sinai? So they explain us something very, very important. What is the symbol of Mount Sinai? The symbol of Mount Sinai is an important thing. It's written that God was looking to give the Torah by the revelation for a mountain. So in other words, that's going to be a symbol. God comes down on the mountain and addresses all the Jewish people. However, he was looking for the lowest mountain. He did not want a tall, big mountain. The smallest mountain, the lowest. So there has to be a mountain and has to be the lowest. What does that signify? It signifies a very important message. We need to be very strong on our principles. However, don't become egoistic. Be humble. So for one point, a little bit of a mountain to tell us strong, surety, be sure about what you're doing, but at the same time, don't become egoistic. So that's a combination. So in other words, it takes two extremes at once. Yes, we want you to be a mountain, but not Mount Everest. Mount Sinai, a lower mountain. That becomes the introduction here. Why is it so important here? Because what are we talking about here? We are not talking about spiritual stuff. Many commandments till now were dealing with a lot of spirituality. Here is hitting right there where it's sensitive, the income of the individual, where the individual is involved in mundane things. When we come to an individual and say to him, when you're in a house of worship, you should be humble in front of God. What's the big deal? You're in the house of worship. What else should you do in the house of worship? Be egoistic in the house of worship. So obviously, when in the house of worship, you're praying to God, you're going to be humble. That's maybe the inspiration and the strength that we have. But the question becomes, what happens when I walk out of the house of worship? What happens the day after? What happens when I'm involved in the day-by-day activities? When I'm in the heat of the business, in the heat of a discussion, do I then realize that I should be humble in front of God? So the question becomes, and if I realize that I should be humble in front of God, so maybe I should be just flat like the earth. Comes here the verse and tells us that God's revelation was on Mount Sinai, I don't want you to be flat. I need you to have some strength to yourself. I want you to have principles. I want you to believe in the principles. But at the same time, I want you to be a lower mountain. So therefore, when we deal over here, and in this section, besides the laws of the Shemitah and the laws of Jubilee, it goes into a whole discussion what happens to an individual that doesn't have. He sold his house, how he should be able to get it back. He sold himself as a slave, as a servant to somebody else because he can't afford. So it's talking about a situation where the person has gone down from level to level till he's lost completely any sense of being pride. So therefore, of proud. So therefore, the beginning of this section has to tell us this was said on Mount Sinai to give us the importance, how important it is to be a Sinai and at the same time to be a mountain. And that's the only way we are successful in using properly the laws of sabbatical, even though that not every year this happens, but it's a lesson for us in our day-by-day life that we should always believe and give room to God and realize, yes, we are a mountain, but we are the lowest of lowest. Thank you.